This audio slideshow has been created for Victorian museums who are custodians of shipwreck artefacts. It outlines preventative conservation methods that are within the capabilities of museum workers and volunteers, and provides guidance on when to seek professional help. Shipwrecks are an important part of Australian heritage. The artefacts associated with shipwrecks can tell us much about the past, with information preserved in the item itself, the way it has been preserved or corroded on the sea floor, and in the positioning of the artefact within the shipwreck. Shipwreck artefacts differ from other historic museum items in three ways. Firstly, if they are from a shipwreck more than 75 years old, they have protective legislation that applies to them. See the legislation audio slideshow for more information. Secondly, shipwreck artefacts have an intrinsic appeal to the general public, as coming from another world that is not easily accessible to them. Thirdly, shipwreck artefacts have a major transition from a very wet but stable environment to a very dry and changeable environment. If this transition is not controlled carefully and monitored appropriately, then the shipwreck artefacts, which may have survived several hundred years underwater, may not survive very long in the museum environment. This is why shipwreck artefacts require specialist care to prevent them from crumbling and corroding away. The general principle of conservation is to perform minimum intervention on artefacts to ensure that they survive as long as possible. Preventative conservation is a subdiscipline that involves preventing artefacts from deteriorating by controlling the environment around them. While only professional conservators should carry out conservation, museum workers and volunteers are able to incorporate preventative conservation techniques in day-to-day museum operations. Conservation basics include correct artefact handling and good housekeeping. See Museum Collection Care Fact Sheet for more information. It also involves creating a stable environment for the artefacts, which does not need to be an expensive process. Insulation or a climate control system can be added to the building, but less expensive solutions are adding curtains to windows or even permanently blocking off windows to reduce the light and therefore heat. Other helpful hints are keeping fragile items, whether on display or storage, away from outside walls where the temperature will fluctuate with the weather. Boxing artefacts will also create an extra protective barrier against the environmental changes and also reduce the risk of breakage and chipping. Using cool beam or dichroic lamps and having lights outside of display cases ensures that there is appropriate light to view the objects without the heat that can damage the artefacts. See the Conservation and Lighting Fact Sheet for more information. Shipwreck artefacts will survive underwater to varying degrees depending on what material they are made from. Museum workers and volunteers are most likely to encounter shipwreck items of wood, metal, ceramics and glass. For each material type, the preventative conservation and monitoring techniques that can be completed by museum workers and volunteers will be explained. The preventative conservation procedure for wooden shipwreck items is to store or display them in a cool, stable environment and away from strong light. Wooden items in warm, humid environments can be subject to higher instances of biological growth, such as mould, and more prone to insect attack, while fluctuating seasonal conditions can cause the timber to shrink and crack. It is important to maintain good housekeeping routines to reduce the risk of insect and other biological attack. When attempting to move wooden artefacts, remember that while an artefact may look to be in sound physical condition, it may be fragile structurally from the degradation processes of cellulose breakdown and marine worm, so always keep it well supported when lifting or carrying. Monitor wooden artefacts in storage and display spaces for drying out and shrinkage. Also keep an eye out for deterioration by biological means. Stains or blooms, algal or fungal growth, bird and rodent droppings, and wood dust are all indicators of biological attack. Preventative conservation for metal items involves desalination followed by storage or display in a cool, low-light, stable environment with low humidity to prevent corrosion from continuing. Keep like metals together and away from dissimilar metals, which will also prevent corrosion from starting again. Do not remove corrosion products or concretions, as these could be holding the artefact together or could contain important historical or environmental information. On no account use abrasive cleaners or wire brushes on metal artefacts, as these can remove maker's marks or other small details. If the museum finds it necessary to remove concretions, be sure to seek professional advice first. Monitor metal artefacts in their stable display or storage environments. Watch out for new corrosion activity or salt buildup appearing on the surface of metal artefacts, and if they do, seek the advice of a qualified conservator. When completing preventative conservation procedures for ceramics, do not clean stains or remove marine growth, as they can contain important information and may also be integral in holding the item together. Glazed surfaces can be very fragile and should be treated with care. Seek professional advice before attempting to restore or glue together pieces of a broken ceramic. Conservation-grade adhesives are required to ensure long-term adhesion without long-term adverse side effects. Do not empty the contents of any vessel, as this can provide vital information about the purpose of the vessel. Care needs to be taken to pack artefacts carefully for storage or transportation, and adequate support needs to be arranged for artefacts when on display. In the long term, watch the outside surface of ceramics for the build-up of salt, as this is an indication of an incomplete desalination process. Seek professional advice from a qualified conservator if this happens. The preventative conservation method for glass is to carefully pad any glass in storage and provide adequate support for any glass shipwreck item on display. Take all measures to avoid chipping and breakage of these very fragile items. Do not clean the surface of glass to remove staining or marine growth, as this could lead to the surface flaking off. Watch for delamination or flaking of the surface of the glass artefacts and seek guidance of a qualified conservator if this happens. If a new shipwreck artefact is discovered and brought to the museum, it should first be reported to Heritage Victoria's Maritime Heritage Unit. Then a conservator specialising in maritime artefact conservation should be consulted. However, there are some simple procedures that can be completed by non-conservators to ensure that the artefact does not rapidly deteriorate. These can be considered as first aid procedures for shipwreck artefacts. To start with, keep the artefact wet at all times. Either keep the item totally submerged in an appropriate sized tub filled with water, or if the item is too large, wrap it with material that will retain the moisture and keep the item wet. Refer to a conservator for the next steps. If a conservator suggests you commence a desalination treatment, ensure that the fresh water surrounding the artefact is changed regularly, as the salt will be leaching out of the artefact into the water in a continuous cycle. When changing the water, be sure that there is not a flood of water travelling past the item, as this could cause sections to break off. The levels of salt coming out of the artefact must be monitored by a conservator to ensure that all the salt has been removed before the very slow drying process can begin. No fans or heaters should be used for this purpose. Air drying is the best method for some artefacts, but not for others, so seek the advice of a conservator. Now, the artefact may look ready to put into storage or on display, but the conservation process is ongoing. The artefact will require long-term monitoring to ensure that it does not corrode, become pest-infested, or disintegrate. See the fact sheet for more information.